some people might look at this as an overdeveloped sense of confidence, but if nothing else, I believe in my capability to do something. And that doesn't mean I'm going to be good at it today. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to fail at
Yeah.
these things, but I really believe in myself. And when I make decisions in my life, I spend time reflecting on those decisions. And it's not me sitting down journaling every day. It's taking inventory of, okay, I had a thought and made a choice. How did it work out?
Hmm.
Did I learn something or was I successful? Because
Yeah.
both of those are wins.
Yeah.
And every time I've reviewed a lot of those decisions, I
Man,
gain more confidence in myself to make decisions
I
and
love that.
my risk tolerance goes up.
Hello, and on today's MTB Performance Project, we have guest Alex Hubelbank. Alex, great to have you today.
Hey, Mickey, haven't seen you in a long time.
Yeah, we were catching up before we hit record. It's been a minute. We kind of met each other through the you did one of your clinical rotations with us here at the Annex and Resilient back in 2020, right? The summer of 2020. So
Oh
it's
yeah.
been almost 5 years now that we're approaching the summer of 2025.
I can't even believe it. Yeah, back in my home state. So it was a very interesting 3 months of mid-COVID clinical times. But
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly been following what you've been doing since then. A lot of cool stuff, it seems, all over the map. You're either posting pictures on Instagram of airplanes, airports, beaches, or courtside. So like great seats and
checks
great
out.
kicks. Like you're always rocking the nice J's. So
Yes,
I
I was
love
gonna
it.
say I've achieved it. I like my Instagram makes it seem like everything's put together perfect.
Yes, yes, it's finally curated, but there's always a story behind that, and I'd love to kind of jump into that first because as we were talking off air, like there 10, 15 years ago, getting into this like world strength conditioning world or human performance, like there was only a few options, right? And now there's a lot, and your story is a testament to that. So tell us a little bit about like kind of like your career trajectory, like because I know you were doing stuff before you saw us at the Annex and through PTs before PT school. So kind of talk us through your career trajectory of where you started and kind of where you are now.
That's definitely one of my favorite topics, just the non-linear trajectory of careers now. To your point, there used to be a very narrow path for people, and I don't think I intentionally looked at it as I had all these options, but I've always kind of believed that you could do whatever you want. And that was a value instilled by my parents from a very young age. But I thought that I was going to be a physical therapist in the NBA. Like that was my plan. I thought I was going to be a physical therapist from a pretty young age, not even because I per se wanted to help people. It just felt like this is the best avenue for me to be involved with people and make an impact on them for a longer period of time than being something like a doctor or a surgeon or other areas of healthcare. So I pursued that through athletic training. And then when I graduated from athletic training school, I knew I was going to apply to PT school at some point, and I was feeling a little bit like I should maybe explore other avenues, not because I wanted to do something else, but because I wanted to be really sure, especially because of the cost of PT school. And there was kind of, I feel like this change was going on in the 2010s where avenues were starting to open up differently. Physical therapy and performance was changing. I feel like the performance world, and at that point, I wasn't even in the performance world, it was growing a little bit where there were more of these gyms popping up. Amateur athletics was becoming more popular and something that you could almost make a career out of. I mean, shoot, in 2014, Instagram was still becoming popular. Like the fact that, 11 years ago, social media wasn't, everyone didn't have it. So I think it started to open my mind a little bit. And, I was a broke 22-year-old. So I was living in Boston and I really didn't want to move home to New Jersey. Sorry at that time. So I ended up, I frequented the Apple store because I was just tech illiterate. And every time I went there, I felt like I learned something. So one day I'm at the Genius Bar, and the same like age-old question from the technician was, have you tried turning it off and turning it back on? And every time I'm like, no, I haven't tried that. Obviously, I've just been clicking the ignore button on, whatever Windows popping up that probably told me the solution to the problem. But after that, they were like, okay, you come here all the time. Why don't you just work here? And I sat with it for a second. I'm like, oh, I mean, I need a job, and I mean, sure, I'll try it. And in my interview in 2014, they asked me, "What do you want to do in 5 years? What is kind of your career? What are your career goals?" And I said, "Well, be a physical therapist in the NBA." And they're like, "This is neither the NBA, and you are not a physical therapist." I said, "I know, but whatever." And I ended up staying there for 4 years, and it was one of the most impactful, if not pivotal experiences of my life, because it did reinforce what I wanted to do, but it taught me a lot of things that you normally don't learn when you go into healthcare or performance, which was a lot about business, about company culture, about hierarchies, about delivering feedback, about communication, about how businesses make decisions. And obviously, you're a business owner, you've gone through a lot of those experiences yourself, but I had none. And I was in my early 20s. And so it gave me a very unique experience because I ended up in a job in business development for Apple. So I was responsible for working with companies who were trying to grow and scale their tech infrastructure internally. So I got to hear, okay, if you're a sole proprietor, how do you make decisions? If you have a 10-person company, how do you make decisions? How do you wake up every day with this vision of your company when you've not made a single dime and you have 3 kids at home and a family and all these bills to pay, and you're still so passionate and sure of yourself that or even if you're not, you have to wake up every day and figure out whether this dream is worth continuing to pursue. That was really eye-opening and motivating because I got to see behind the curtain of companies that are household names to us, but how they operate and the ones that were successful long term. And so I continued to learn for 4 years. And then at some point, I was in a position where it was sort of the fork in the road. I was in my mid 20s, and it was kind of okay, if I don't pursue PT school now, I'm going to continue down this other path. And very similarly to why I started at Apple, it was sort of okay, I could put a bow on this and go do this other thing, because if I don't do it, I'm always going to wonder what if. And
Yeah.
that started to, I mean, I made two really big life decisions in going there, staying there, and then leaving. Um, that started to open my mind to the possibility of what you can do. And it was almost a self permission. So
Yeah.
I went to PT school. Well, I applied to PT school, but in that time, I started to pursue, okay, well, the performance world is something that I feel like is the foundation of physical therapy. And in my own
Hmm.
experiences, having had 7 knee surgeries, playing high level sports, soccer, and then rugby, I was just starting to scratch the surface on what the weight room could do for me, and wishing I had learned about it, 20 years prior. But it was enticing. So I ended up getting into PT school. But again, I had started in the performance world, and I was like, I could do this for 3 months and put it on my resume that I was an intern, or I can take another year, defer school, and spend that whole year diving as deep as I possibly can, because I think this is a foundation. And that's not just put some letters behind your name. That's, well, what are you trying to get out of this experience? So did that and went to PT school, thought I was going to work for an NBA team, which I somehow magically did. And it, the universe had a different plan for me. So I ended
Always
up
does.
leaving that role, and that's, a story for another day. But, things, I do believe that things happen for a reason. And so I ended up leaving and found kind of the private side of pro sport, went back into a team environment on a short-term contract to provide support for a specific player, and then came back into the private side where I basically, as we spoke offline, was on tour of the United States
Yeah.
for the past 2 years. And that kind of landed me here to where I am now in Phoenix, Arizona. In telling this story, I'm realizing I make really big life decisions. And I just kind of go 2 feet in, but they're pretty, I mean, they're calculated of what am I trying to get out of this? And for me, learning and being around really intelligent people, but also being able to work in the athletic population, primarily in professional athletes. But I'm learning that my personality does really well on the private side of that. So, how can I mesh all of the things that I really enjoy, create community, have a large impact, learn every day, have autonomy of my time, and then also the other piece of it, which I'm sure we'll get to, is prioritize my own training because I think that adds value to what I do. So it was a super long-winded story, but it's been basically 10, 11 years, probably even more than that, of this journey and figuring out what is it supposed to look like. And people, I feel like, say that your 30s are when you start to enjoy your life a little bit more. Like you think that your 20s were really fun and they were, but then in your 30s life starts to open up a little bit, and I think I'm experiencing that for sure.
Yeah, and so a lot of the things I heard there is like it seems like you had some common things that you were looking to get out of each experience, right? Like you said, learning and people, like being around like really smart, intelligent people is really important. It sounds like in each one of those scenarios, you were able to be around those two things, like a good learning environment, like Apple, PT school, all your clinicals, and then through your experience professionally after that, and then you've been around like good cultures, right? And it's interesting because your experience is pretty atypical, right? Like you talked about how the
Extremely.
nuance and learning of like the business side and the culture and the importance of communication and systems and all that, you learn that first. Whereas like myself, like I just went, blind into the business world almost 20 years ago, and I'm like, well, I know I love to coach, I want to learn, I want to like, that was my thing, and I built a business on that. And then my business grew to a certain point until it couldn't. And I was like, all right, now I need to figure out these things. That's the limiting factor. I'm the limiting factor. And so, you just got that stuff out of the way earlier. So,
Yeah, I mean, I commend and I look at people that do what you've done, and to you're the person that I was talking about at Apple. You're the person that's
yeah,
like, I believe
yeah,
so strongly in my product. I believe so strongly in what I do that I'm going to wake up every day and continue to do this to the best of my abilities. And I'm sure,
yeah,
we could go a mile deep into all the things that
yes,
you learn early in business. And that's exactly why. I mean, I was there year one at Apple, and I was wanting to go pursue PT, but something was telling me I'm learning some skills and I'm learning about
yeah,
how businesses work that
hmm,
I will not get if I leave this now. And
yeah,
I didn't put a timeline on it. And I think that's one of my main kind of mantras in life, is to not put timelines on the things that I do. There's a general idea, but there more so it's okay, how long am I continuing to get the value out of these things? And with Apple, it was I needed another 3 years to really feel like I could put a bow on, okay, I do feel like I've understood this and I'm getting to my point of all the frustrations are outweighing the positives. So it's time for me to go, which is a good
yeah.
learn of any experience. Like you got to know when your time to go is.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like in all those experiences, like what was kind of the point that you had to reach where like, oh, all right, I think I've overstayed my welcome, or I think it's time to leave at this point.
I can give you a very specific one from my time at Apple. This is one of my favorite stories. Mike Robertson, out
Yep.
of Indiana, who runs the Physical Prep podcast. So I had, it was, I guess, 2017, and
Hmm.
I was training out of this private S&C facility in Boston, or in Waltham, flight performance that I ended up working at. I was starting to listen to the Physical Prep podcast every day on my drive to work at Apple, where I was doing account management. And I was realizing that so much more of my life and my curiosities were in the performance and health world. And I was still getting a lot of value out of Apple, but it was a lot of frustrations were bothering me. And they were things that, years prior, they didn't change. They didn't get any worse. Nothing got different. My schedule was great. I was in a good spot, but it was sort of, I'm recognizing that the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning isn't me going to work at Apple anymore. And it's this other area. And very specifically, I was in an interview to go work at corporate, and I had gone through this whole process, and there was this part of me, again, this gut feeling that was telling me I'm not being super true to myself right now because there's this other thing I really want to do, but I'm pretending because it's exciting to be wanted. It's exciting to progress in your career. Obviously, being an athlete, like being competitive in all aspects of your life. I'm like, I have to do this to the best of my abilities. And I was literally listening to the podcast, driving to my interview, and Mike had asked his guest one piece of advice you would give your younger self. And the guest said, I would have made myself more uncomfortable earlier in my life. And so I went in
I
and I
love that.
quit. I was like, it
Yeah.
was just the right time. It just happened. And it was like, if I don't do this now, I'm never going to do it. So
Yeah.
knowing what the right time was sort of just taking inventory of my life. And then sometimes these things just hit you
Yeah.
and you know,
Yeah, it's
and it's
almost
more
like the
just having
universe was
permission.
speaking to you. Yeah, it was almost like that, like you were certainly getting pulled in that direction, and then all of a sudden one day the universe spoke to you, and you're like, "All right, I've been putting this
Yeah.
off. I've known it in the back of my mind. Like this was like, all right, it's time." So,
And I will say, some people might look at this as an overdeveloped sense of confidence, but if nothing else, I believe in my capability to do something. And that doesn't mean I'm going to be good at it today. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to fail at
yeah.
these things, but I really believe in myself. And when I make decisions in my life, I spend time reflecting on those decisions. And it's not me sitting down journaling every day. It's taking inventory of, okay, I had a thought and made a choice. How did it work out?
Mhm.
Did I learn something or was I successful? Because
Yeah.
both of those are wins.
Yeah.
And every time I've reviewed a lot of those decisions,
Oh,
I
man.
gain more confidence in myself to make decisions, and
I love that.
my risk tolerance goes up, honestly.
Yeah. Oh my God. I love that so much because that is growth. James Clear talks about like stacking like daily wins is like just casting votes towards the person you want to become. And so at this point, you've had so many data points proving to you that you are capable of doing these things. I mean, this is a daily conversation I have with my children because I'm trying to get them to like understand like I understand like doing chores sucks, all these things sucks, but like you realize you can change, you have the power to change if you so choose. But like you said, you gave yourself the permission, you got yourself in an uncomfortable position, but you had confidence that you like no matter what, you'd figure out the answers, you'd figure out how to get to the other side of that being uncomfortable, being outside of your comfort zone. And that's, I mean, I think if you can continue to be okay with that, like that's huge. I love that. I love that.
And I'll be honest, I wasn't thinking about this maybe before, but obviously you don't get places by yourself.
Hmm.
One big one, that this value was instilled in me very early in life by my dad, but then I graduated from undergrad, and there's a reason why I didn't go straight into practicing as an athletic trainer. And it wasn't 100% the fact that you don't really make any money. That it wasn't 100%, but that was certainly a component of it because I sort of knew, okay, I'm going to do some per diem, obviously, to build my skill set, but I'm going to go to PT school. And I had believed I was going to do that a lot sooner. But the Apple experience came up, and when I had graduated, I sort of was feeling this imposter syndrome and level of inadequacy and this like, oh, I'm not good enough. I don't, and a lot of fear. And going to Apple, and people are going to think that I'm, a paid actor here for Apple, but I'm not. But, if you don't know what you want to do, I tell people, if you don't know
Yeah.
what you want to do, go get a part-time job working at Apple and you will figure it out.
Yeah.
Because what I learned there of myself was, one, that I am capable of things. I went from tech illiterate to being a like high level technical expert, and I ended up more on the people side of things, but that also was
Yeah.
eye opening. It's, oh, okay, I'm really good at working with people. I'm really good at de-escalating difficult situations. I can connect with anyone. I can manage a room. I can learn how to speak on the fly in front of 310 people every day and
Yeah.
say something concise and impactful. It built my confidence in skills I already had. It highlighted areas of opportunity, and then allowed me to tune out the things that right now I'm not working on. So, for example, there's a lot of time invested into personal development and professional development when you work there. So you every quarter or more, you go into your towering strengths, your opportunities, and your weaknesses. And whenever I get asked, like, what are your weaknesses? I turn that around to say what my opportunities versus my weaknesses are. Weaknesses to me are things that you're not actively working on because they're not a priority. Opportunities are things that you are actively invested in working on. And towering strengths and strengths are the things that you're either good or great at. What is your superpower? What is your strength? So that alone changed me because for 4 years, I walked into work every day and was like, I am capable of getting better today. I'm capable of learning things. I am capable of investing in myself. And that is maybe selfish, but also it is empowering to know that every day that you try is an opportunity. And I carry that. And so to kind of bring this full circle, a lot of the reasons I've been able to make really big decisions and I think get to where I want to be and feel so confident in myself is not because I walked out the gate and was really good at something. It was because I walked out the gate with a plan and understanding more of who I am and what areas I will always need to work on and what areas will come naturally to me and when to kind of pull those strings to turn one up or turn one down.
Getting back to your previous point where like, you said you've made some big life decisions, but seems like they've been very calculated because of, again, the data points where you've proven to yourself that like, look, this is a big jump and most people would perceive that as such. But I know when I get there or wherever I'm working or whomever I'm working with, like I can extrapolate value and I'm confident that I can do well. So yeah, I mean, that was going to be my question. Like, as far as like, what are those guiding principles that you felt were, that you learned through Apple that kind of helped parse out like all those decision making? And it sounds like all that stuff from risk taking, understanding like how to attack your opportunities, not weaknesses, and just kind of make sure like in every situation like you're creating value, not just for yourself but the people around you.
It's kind of a hot take of let your weaknesses be your weaknesses, not because you shouldn't work on them, but what is the value of working on this weakness right now?
Yeah,
Where does that fall in your priority list? Because at the end of the day, we all have multiple identities of who we are. It is, we have our, outside of work life. And I think for the people that work in healthcare and performance, that there's not a lot of that. It's almost like we wrap up our entire lives into our work for better or for worse. And it's really hard to extract and say, what do I want? And what is something that I will say to myself very often, and it comes up. It's almost like I don't mean to think about it, and then I'm asking myself the same question, which is, what is the most right thing right now? And sometimes, and people don't want to talk about this in our professions, but money is the most right thing right now. Sometimes that is the answer, and that's okay. And so that's how I've started to make more of my decisions of when I'm going to take an opportunity. It used to be more about experience. And that is, I think when you're younger, you have to just say yes to everything
absolutely. Yeah.
and you have to take every experience. Obviously, you have to look at it and say, well, does the value outweigh the risk here? But
Yeah.
I worked for free for a really long time for a lot
Yep.
of people to build up a specific skill set. And the way I describe it to people now is there's a top down versus a bottom up approach to your career. And when you're younger, you have to take the top down approach, which is to say you have to take a job or an internship or a role. And that role is very defined and it's very clear and it has rules. And sometimes the money is not very good or there's a lot of dirty work you have to do, but you have to do that. But then there comes this point that you reach, and sometimes you don't even realize it until you're, a couple years into it, where now it's from the bottom up. And I think that's when people's lives start to creep in. They get older, they get married, they have kids, they move, you know, I call them, there was a book that I once read. It's called Life is in the Transitions. One of my favorite books. I think everyone should read it. But he talks about life quakes versus disruptors, and you have these things that come up in life that you don't always get to choose. And these life quakes alter your trajectory. Well, then you have to start building your career from the bottom up because your career becomes more of a part, not the whole of your life. And you've earned that. You put in time to work. I mean, and so that's, I think, where I am now is to start looking at these things less of I have to say yes to everything, and I'm practicing that, or practicing not doing that. But now
Yep.
saying, okay, well, what's my dream job? Don't put any limits on it. Obviously, don't be ridiculous, but being ridiculous would be saying I want to earn $1 million a year, but for what reason? I don't live like I need $1 million a year. So why would I say that number? So what is my dream job? But be realistic about it. Not because you should put limits on it, but because what do you want and what do you need? And that should start to tell you what is the most right thing right now.
Yeah, and it sounds like, you had said earlier about like your 20s versus your 30s, and for a lot of people it's like it's like a flywheel, right? In your 20s, like you have to do a lot of hard work to get that wheel going, right? And if you're doing the right things and surrounding yourself by the right people and learning from experiences and mistakes, like that thing starts going, and by your 30s you start to reap the compounding effects of all that hard work. The challenging thing is where, like you said it, like people have to realize that like that's part of most people's transitions, right? Like it's very atypical for people to basically in their 20s get like the dream job, and it's possible, but for the most part it's like you have to put in your work, like, and just set yourself up and be willing to do things that I had John O'Neill on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. Like he had talked about that, where like you have to do things first and then ask to get paid. Like it's not like, hey, I want to do this job, but you got to pay me first. I'm like, no, that's not how the real world works.
Right.
Where's the value, right? Prove to me you can do it, and then, at least in my world as a small business owner, like that's kind of what happens. And
Right.
I think more people need to look at it from that perspective than the other way around. So,
And, I think that taps into something I've been thinking about even more recently. I forget where I read this, but it gave a lot of credence to something I already believed, which is when you attach money to something, it inherently devalues
hmm
someone's skill set in doing it. And what I mean by that is when you offer to pay someone for something, their motivation then actually goes down to do it.
yeah,
And your point is definitely well made, where you need to show value first, because that also tells me how badly do you want to do this? And
hmm
maybe the answer is that this is
yes,
not it, but you've created this idea. And again, this is a whole conversation in itself, but social media has driven a lot of that. And the opening of the industry is positive, but also I think drives people to this societal belief of, okay, I'm going to do this thing. And I'm the queen of asking why, but not just why one time. I say you have to go 5 whys deep to really get to uncovering, well, why you want to be a strength coach in the NBA. Why do you want to work in pro sports? And a lot of times I uncover for people, they probably don't actually want to do that. And that's an existential crisis they have to reconcile alone. But I try really hard to give people permission to not do some of those things if they don't actually want to, because it's okay. Not everyone has to do this. And I say this coming from the standpoint of obviously having worked in the team setting of professional sports, getting an opportunity to put the logo on my Instagram and do all the things and look like I'm having a great time courtside, blah, blah, blah. But I'm like the pro sport Grinch, not because I don't think it's a great experience, but I think people don't have to silo themselves into these jobs that there aren't very many of them. And if you have things that ground you outside of your work, it's okay to lean into those things too. And if you're not willing to wake up every day and not get paid for something, I don't know if that's the right profession for you. Right? Obviously, there's a line, but if you don't wake up every day and you want to listen to the strength and conditioning podcast while you're driving to your other job, that if that's not any indication, maybe that's not actually, you haven't found your thing yet.
it sounds like that's something you're really good at, is from a self awareness standpoint. Like you understand what value you want from things, right? And getting back to the like the pro sports culture and title standpoint, I don't think a lot of people really understand the sacrifices and the challenges that those people are faced with. Yes, there's probably a lot of like upside and fun components to it.
For sure.
Anybody who's been around pro sports, some a little bit better than others, but there's like the culture, it's very challenging, right? It's very stressful. It's very unforgiving and quick to quick to throw you out if you don't, do exactly what's been asked, or if you don't perform up to your standards. And it's like it's a challenge. And I think a lot of people see that and the perception of what it brings. They probably, if they value, free time and autonomy and all these things, like that's probably not the best case for you, right? and I speak with so many gym owners about that, and it's like, well, people want to make more money, but they also want to have more free time and more freedom. And it's like, well, during certain parts of the growth of your business, like you can't have both. Maybe eventually you can, but it's like those are two conflicting things. And it's in any profession, like you just have to understand like what is it that you want out of this, right?
Hmm.
And really get clear with those goals and expectations, and also get clear with like what it's going to take to get there. And I think that's where the delusion is for some people. So
Yeah, no, you absolutely hit the nail on the head. I ask this question to many people who inquire about working in pro sports. I say, okay, well, would you do it for 25,000 a year? And when you start to ask some of these questions, would you do it if you had to cancel your wedding? Would you do it if you had to live on the road for X period of time? And it's not
yeah.
about whether the answer is yes or no. It's about, have you thought about what you would have to give up to do this? So I thought I was prepared to go into professional sports, and I was very much like, I'll move anywhere, I'll do anything. I'm here. And I had a little bit of a rude awakening around how little autonomy of my time I had. You have a lot of time, but you don't know when it's coming, and the challenges that come with just being in that kind of environment. And it it really opened my eyes to, okay, what do I actually want, and for what window of time am I willing to give these things up? And I still struggle with this every day of recognizing what value am I bringing? What value am I getting? How long do I want to do this for? What do I want? And so that's a practice that I'm working on, is to not look so far into the future. I think I was having
Yeah,
a
that's
conversation
tough.
with a mentor of mine the other day about, on paper, I might look flighty because I've moved so much, I've done so many different things. But to your point, they are very calculated.
Yeah.
And it's not that I'm jumping from one thing to the next. It's sort of I'm snowballing into, oh, an opportunity presents itself. One is kind of sundowning, the other one is coming up. And how can I be strategic to find things that capture not only my attention, I think that's the easier part, but the things that are really important to me from a value system in my total life.
All this is such wonderful insight, and most people need to really the biggest lesson I think people should take away from this is like the five whys is perfect. Like
Mm,
if you can't ask yourself that in terms of why you're sticking in one place or moving to another position, and like why what anything matters, I think it's a good litmus test for people to really make changes or make decisions in their lives. So I appreciate you
definitely.
sharing all that. Kind of from a training standpoint, you're kind of in the on the private side of working with like professional athletes and things like that. So, you said you went from being in a team setting to now private. So, what are some of the challenges that you've kind of experienced? Because, like, I've experienced it too. Like working with pro athletes in their off season, there's a certain level of collaboration that needs to happen with the organizations. Sometimes you don't see eye to eye. Sometimes it's somewhat challenging. What are some things that have helped you from working through that environment, and from a relationship standpoint, from a communication standpoint, what are some things that have helped you navigate all of that with working with those athletes?
The another age-old question. uh, the heavy hitters today. No, so because I had worked on the team side, I obviously got to see behind the curtain of how at least two teams operate. Have been fortunate to have relationships with a lot of other staffs within the NBA. They are all very different. They all have very different roles and expectations. And so I guess my number one is always to take inventory of the situation and say, okay, who pays me? Because that's the number one person that I have to be accountable to. And if that is the team, then my number one responsibility is to the team. My number two responsibility is to the athlete, obviously. But and then if the athlete is paying me, or let's say even their agency is paying me, or it doesn't matter who it is, I just need to know who it is. It could be even, on the younger side where I've worked with some elite high school or college, maybe it's their parent. Or now with NIL, there's other players involved in the conversation. So who is responsible for paying the bill? Because I have to reconcile expectations with that person or that organization first. The second piece, what are my existing relationships with all of the people who have to have a hand in this? So if I'm operating as the performance coach, well, do they have medical? Do they have an agent? Do they have a partner, a spouse that needs to be involved in the conversation? Do they have other people, a doctor that they travel with, or, any number of people? And I have to, again, take inventory of who are the stakeholders within this conversation. And then layer three, like I said, so what relationships do I have with those people? So how many are there? Who are they? And what relationships do I have with them? If I have existing relationships, obviously that makes it a little bit easier, unless they're contentious relationships, which I've had both. And then from there, what are the existing expectations of all of these people? So I'm sure you've had this experience where you obviously have a philosophy of training and the athlete doesn't have that same philosophy, but for some reason they want to work with you. And that goes back to some of the why conversation. Well, why are you here? Why are you doing this now? What is driving you to be here? Because a lot of the athletes I've worked with, they work with me because they got frustrated with their team. And that's not poo-pooing on any team, because like I said, I've been on both sides of it. I see all that goes into these situations and it's not simple at all. And there's so much context that could drive an athlete to make a different decision. And one of them could be as simple as they got paid. So now they have
Hmm.
the means to do it. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah.
Like that, this will mean I have a job for a long time. But it's really taking inventory of the context before you dive into the technical piece. With that said, I have to then set very clear expectations to everyone involved of what is my role? How do you perceive me being a participant? Do you want my opinion or do you just want me to deliver a program? Do you want me to push you or you just want me to show up? Am I a rep counter or am I a partner? And that's a, again, really important distinction. And you know, going back to decisions I've now made, there are some athletes that I've said, hey, this is great, but I'm not going to be the right person for you because I don't want to be a rep counter. That's not what I'm here for. We just have mismatched expectations, which means that if I ask you to do, 4 training sessions a week and you only show up for 2, but then we get to the end of the summer and I'm the person you worked with, that's not reflective of the work that I wanted to do, but you're going to perceive it as my fault. And when,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Those are those are challenging conversations to navigate, both with you and the athlete, and then also now you and the organization, because
exactly, because I send them
it
back.
puts you in, yeah, it puts you in a really tough spot. And I've had those experiences too. And like you want what's best for that athlete, right? And you know what you're capable of delivering. But if that athlete's not going to go all in with you, like, then it's not a clear expectation
Right.
of or representation of what your training can produce, right? And
And
then it becomes a challenge.
I've had a mentor of mine, Anthony Iannarino, who is, in the circle,
Hmm.
who once said to me, because a mentor of his told him this, you can measure your success by the number of hard conversations you're willing to have. And
Hmm.
dang, that hits
Willing to
so
have.
hard.
Yeah.
And that's
Yes.
what we're talking about, which is, I think when you're younger, or I don't want to say younger in age, but it's younger in career, or when you don't have a lot of these experiences under your belt, it's really scary to have hard conversations because you're also potentially talking yourself out of a job. So expectations might not be as clear, but I have learned this the hard way many times now. And I think I have enough perspective now to say, okay, I got to just do this. Because if they don't want to work with me because of my expectations or that we're mismatched, I have to just own that because I'm tired of carrying this anxiety around with me that
Yes.
but we don't need it. It's not good.
Man.
I'm not a good version of myself right now.
Yes. That's another gem, because I'll tell you, like, I can't agree more, because when I was younger, like, I'm like, you know what?
I just
Maybe I
really
just
want to
wasn't
work with them.
maybe I just wasn't capable of having those tough conversations. Now I'm okay having, whether it's with anybody really. And I find myself, like, when I'm a very introverted, like, reserved person, so I avoid a conflict at all costs. But now I'm certainly not, like, conflict averse. Like, I'm not trying to seek out conflict, but I'm certainly okay with it, because generally, to me, it's like, if a conversation needs to be had, and that's the next step in order for myself or that individual to grow, like, I owe it to them and to myself to have that conversation. because if I don't, we both lose. Like the whole being uncomfortable, like you have to run into those situations that are going to create you to be uncomfortable, because that's when you get better.
And I think earlier in life, I was like, I could just ignore, I'm going to ignore
Yeah.
it. And then
Yeah.
at some point, I don't know when I got this wise. I don't think I am very wise, but at some point, I'm like, okay, what happens the longer I don't have this conversation?
Yeah.
It doesn't
Yeah.
get better. It actually gets
Yes.
worse.
Yeah.
And I was talking to a friend of mine who owns a gym recently who had to let go of an employee. And I'm sure you know that that can be probably one of the most difficult things you have to do, especially in our industry where things are really small. There's a lot of relationships, and um, we talked about it. It's like, okay, to your point, this is about not you're not letting them go, firing them because you hate them and they're terrible. Not always, sometimes maybe, but the you're promoting them out. You're promoting them into their next opportunity because for some reason this isn't it anymore. And that's I think goes back to the expectation setting and the are we a good fit? And earlier I wouldn't have done that because the more important thing to me was more experiences under my belt, more opportunities, more money in some ways. And so I said yes, 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 yes. And then at some point I was like, okay, I've achieved enough data points. Now I need to be more selective because everyone will get better from me being more selective and thoughtful about I don't have to work with every person that asks me to work with them because I get excited about being wanted. I should be more strategic because I'm going to be happier and this person's going to be happier with the product and the outcome.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, it's like whoever's who are you serving, right? Being very clear with that, being clear with like what's the expectations of that individual. And look, sometimes having a challenging conversation with that individual is what they need,
Hmm.
right? And that's what they're paying you for. And it might not be what they want to hear. And you might risk not working with them. And that's okay. But it takes maturity, and it's like the humane thing to do, which I wish more people were courageous enough to have those conversations.
And it's
And
not
I'm
easy.
again, no, and it kind of falls in the category of like sometimes we make those conversations and those experiences, we make them up in our head to be way harder than they actually are. And so one of the tactics I use is, and I verbalize it to the individual. I'm like, look, my goal with this conversation is to get resolution on this.
That's
Like
smart.
I'm coming at this with love and empathy because I want you and this situation to get better. Because
Right.
I think we can both agree it's not great, and you can apply that to anything. And so
Hmm.
sometimes framing conversations and going into conversations with individuals in that light, it just like sets the guard down. I'm like, look, I'm not here to win an argument. I'm here to
Hmm.
create resolution on X. Can we
Yep.
do this? Like,
Yep.
can we agree like we need to do that? Wonderful. Like, so now let's lay all our chips out on the table. And that's one tactic that's really helped me in that regard, and in being a leader in my business, in like as a father and husband, and like and just as a friend. Like you have to have more of those conversations as you get older, and can't avoid them.
Yeah, and that I would say that's probably the number one challenge, and that's why I go back to step back for a second and acknowledge that it isn't just you and the other person. Where do all of the priorities lie? Where does the money lie? Because unfortunately, pro sports is a business, and so if an organization is paying for something, that matters only from the standpoint of, okay, well, if they're footing the bill, then I need to understand what their expectations are. So, for example, when I've worked with athletes in the off season and I know I'm delivering them back to a team, I try and align myself with, okay, what is some of the testing that you do? What are your expectations of this athlete? How can I be a good partner to you? And I know that not everyone does that because and here's where it gets complicated. Sometimes the athlete doesn't want you to do that. And if the athlete doesn't want you to do that and they're the one paying the bill, you have to identify, is this the right situation for me? Because am I willing to stamp this if it doesn't align with the organization? What are my goals in my career? And my goals are not to go back into a team setting right now. So I'm a little bit more comfortable with if there's a mismatch in expectations or priorities, I'm okay with that because I want to hope that my reputation will precede me of trying to do right by the athletes and the organizations and do the best work that I can, but sometimes it doesn't always.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of my next question is like, look, somebody who's worked with high level athletes, like we can understand the importance of collaborating and multidisciplinary like collaboration with, you know, PTs, ATCs, strength coaches, medical. Like, what about scenarios where like there is like it's a toxic environment? How do you navigate that? Like,
Thor. uh Run. No, I think that, yeah, again, younger, earlier, I didn't know how to get out of it, of any
yeah,
of them. I felt very much, and this isn't to say that any situation that I had been in was really toxic. It was more, I'm not here at the right time, and I had a mismatch of expectations around what I'm doing here, or what I want, and it becomes glaringly clear. And I think it goes back to you. So every 6 months, I write down what are my priorities. Probably sometimes I actually do it more often. It'll be anytime I have a status change. So did my job change? Did my where I live change? Did something in my personal life change? And then I write down this list of priorities, and I don't put a limit on, is this a work priority or is this a life priority? And then I step back and I look back at my old ones, and then I say, okay, do these align? And it's been interesting because for 5 years, they've been almost identical, like mild variation. But then I say, okay, is what I'm doing right now aligned with that? Whatever the toxic environment is that something that's going to change, or is that driven by how I feel? Because sometimes it can be toxic because of a person, but sometimes it can be toxic because I'm not living true and I feel something about that because I'm the one that's judging it being toxic. And
yeah,
now I'm like, I have
yeah,
to probably remove myself from the situation, which
yeah,
is also really hard to do because it feels like a
yeah,
concession, like you lost something. But it goes back to firing versus promoted out. I think you
yeah,
actually are gaining something, which is living in alignment with what your values are, and or what you need to live true. And for me, timing, I think, is what drives a lot of that. When you're younger, you don't feel as much loss when you're giving up 151 nights of your life because you don't have a lot outside of work that might keep you somewhere for some people.
yeah. And I like the self reflection first, where it's like, well, is this, am I living out alignment of what my goals and priorities are first? And if not, then maybe the situation is not optimal for me. So I want to kind of get in to, because I know you've been doing some like cool stuff from a tech standpoint. What are some, I know this is kind of a big shift from like culture to like
Yeah,
technology,
no, no, no.
but I know this was a topic I'm curious about because it's stuff that we're integrating more and more of in our training processes here at the Annex. But like outside of like the big rocks, like in terms of like GPS and force plates and stuff like that, tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're utilizing from a technology standpoint that's helping driving your training priorities with your athletes.
Biggest one is partially the reason that I moved out here to Phoenix is to work with Andrew Hauser, who is a friend and mentor to me, because I believed that what he's doing out here it's very enticing. And it challenged a lot of my biases. So again, going to making decisions that are both scary and risky, but also I think there's a lot of upside because everybody gets better. So I came out here. Andrew had kind of started to use this pretty heavily. I don't know if you're familiar with Moxie, the NEARS device. That's the brand, but it's a muscle oxygen sensor. So you can put it anywhere on the body. Primarily, we'll use it on the legs or the arms. The vastus lateralis on the leg. That's going to give you a good proxy for kind of generally how the that specific tissue, but overall body is utilizing and delivering oxygen. So what's been the most interesting with that is, so we use that from a training perspective, we use it from a testing perspective, we kind of use it from a monitoring perspective. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people are using wearables like a Whoop and or a Ring. Obviously, those would be independently
Mm-hmm.
purchased, and usually the athlete has to wear them themselves. This is something that we use when they show up to train or get treatment, and it's helping kind of see trends in what is their body doing and what is it telling me at more of a physiological level. So PT School 101 and Training 101 is a lot of objectivity from a mechanical standpoint, peak torque, outputs from a integrated and isolated standpoint. So leg extension or a leg press or a back squat or force plate data from jumps, which is obviously very helpful. But the way that we look at things here, and this has really piqued my curiosity going back to what gets you out of bed and what are the things that you're thinking about and reading. And I thought that I was done reading about the O2 dissociation curve a long time ago, but this is my everyday now where I'm looking at, okay, what is the physiological model? So, how is someone able to recover between bouts of something? So, I'll give you a really specific example. When somebody does a set of split squat and they do it on one of their legs and then they go straight into the other leg. Well, if you have a moxie on their one leg and on their other leg, I can tell you right now, their oxygen level is probably pretty low, which means they're now the second leg they're using, they're basically occluded and they're actually not able to do that set to the best of their abilities. So it's changed some of my thought process around, okay, how do I deliver rest periods and what am I trying to get out of this? Because if I'm getting them to, if I'm trying to get them to work at a level where they are doing conditioning and it's high output but full recovery in between. So for example, like an assault bike, 8 seconds and then 50 seconds. Well, they're generally specific, but they're actually kind of arbitrary because everyone's going to be individualized and their experience on the assault bike, their training age, all these things. So being able to actually see at the physiological level or proxy physiological level, are they actually recovered in 50 seconds or do I need to give them more time to get full recovery to allow their output to be higher for the work? And that's been very kind of disorienting, but also really interesting because it's changed a lot of how I train people. Because instead of just prescribing sets and reps and things, I'm looking at their moxie. Let's say it's on both of their legs, or if we have overhead athletes, like I work with a bunch of pro tennis players. So putting one on their arm and one on their leg and seeing how well do they utilize oxygen in their upper body versus their lower body and back and forth. So I used to program a 4-day split for some of my athletes where it would be lower on one day and upper on the other day, where that actually doesn't align with the sport that they do. And so if they're not great at shifting blood from one area to the other, from one set to the next, then I'm probably not preparing them as well to be able to do that when they do their sport. So it's started to make me, I would say I haven't done a total overhaul yet. I'm now at the point where I'm consciously incompetent. Not incompetent, but I have enough data points to start to
Yeah.
understand and see trends, and I try to actually even predict what trends I'm anticipating and seeing in my athletes when they come in for the day and they put a moxie on, and it's like, oh, this person actually doesn't look as recovered as I would have expected, and that's driven by what is their oxygen showing me. So oxygen as a proxy for their gas tank, and
Hmm.
can I drive that to be bigger through a warm up to be able to actually prepare them for this training session? Or does the warm up need to be the whole training session? Or do I need to pivot and actually just give them recovery because they have to go do a 2-hour training session in their sport after this? And that's going to be more valuable than me trying to hammer them into the ground and then let them go do that.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're still kind of in the early stages of really trying to conceptualize all this stuff and how you're going to operationalize it in your training programs.
Yeah, there are some really specific ones. I would say before, before I've personally adopted it into my overall training, I will say that it's really made me think more about the valuable warm up. And, I think when you come up in this world, you learn about warm ups, then you kind of adopt warm ups, then you kind of have your like general, this is my warm up for these archetypes of people. But now it's made me really start to think, how do I get someone warm enough to prepare them to do the thing I want them to do? Because now I'm seeing the fruits of that labor, or I'm seeing the failure of my warm up.
Got it. What was the main insight you've gleaned from that? Was it from under preparing your athletes or over preparing, or maybe both?
Under preparing.
Under preparing. Okay. Interesting.
And also athletes' perception where they think they're warm, or honestly,
Yeah.
a lot of athletes are not really attuned to their warm up.
No.
They're diligent, so they're willing to do something for an hour. They roll, I call it like, rolling around on the floor or dancing around the weight room. And then they're never actually doing something targeted that's
Yeah.
getting not only their core temperature up, but warming up their tissues to be able to do the thing that I want them to do or that
Got
they
it.
need to do.
So, in terms of getting like really tactical, like what are some of the things, like what are the big differentiators in terms of how you address warm up before? And then in utilizing this tech, like what are the changes you've made? Like
Yeah.
maybe on like a sprint day, for example.
Sure. So one would definitely be recovery times. Instead of prescribing recovery times that are finite, I'm utilizing more flexible recovery times based on both their breath recovery and what their moxie is telling me, whether they've actually been able to fully recover. And that also is telling me when the set is over. Instead of prescribing, okay, you're going to do this many sprints and that's finite, it's okay, well, you're going to sprint and recover until you're not recovering anymore. And that's
Yeah, that was going to be my next
obviously,
question.
yep. So, and that's based on, I'm looking at oxygen and total hemoglobin, which are the two values that you can see. And yeah, I want to keep it pretty simple just for the sake of this conversation, but being able to see their oxygen come up and down on a trend line to whatever their highest point for the day was and their lowest point for the day. And so it's really difficult to make decisions on one data point, but as you start to look at trends, you're seeing how someone's body behaves and how their tissues behave, and you're able to get a little bit smarter. It is very similar to how people use Whoop and Aura to make decisions through HRV. Moxie is giving us that at more of a tissue level and allowing us to go back to it. It really is going back to basic physiology and appreciating, well, all these things that we learned 100 years ago, how am I actually able to apply those? So, for example, using long duration isometrics, both from a building capillary density, increasing tissue temperature, high motor output, but what is that actually doing for my physiology? And then using something like a bike overshoot as a way to build the gas tank in the beginning. So that would be an overshoot would be over 90 RPMs on the bike with a pretty low resistance. And does that work for certain people? And if it doesn't, do they need something fast to be able to build their gas tank? So something like a jump rope. Do they feel like they need to run to warm up? And it's one of my least favorite things would be like, oh, I just need to go run to warm up. And they're doing no prep and then they just go sprint. I'm like, that is
Yeah.
not the way.
Yeah.
But appreciating, okay, what is that feeling that they're driving? And can I reproduce it in a safer way? Or a lower level way that doesn't put so much strain on their structures for them to feel like they get warm.
Got it. Is there any scenario, obviously like you're saying, like we're tracking that objectively to make sure an athlete's fully recovered before we go into their next effort, right? Is there a scenario maybe earlier in an off season where you're trying to just build more from a conditioning standpoint where you're ever going and repeating bouts without full recovery?
Absolutely. But that would be more planful. And it would
Yep.
be, okay, I know that today is a day that's going to tax the nervous system because that's what I'm looking for. That's the stimulus. That is the goal. And yes, to your point, that's absolutely what we're going to do. But we might manipulate the length of the bout to accommodate the fact that at some point, if I let that bout go on too long the first time, they're going to have nothing left for the
Yes,
rest. And
absolutely.
that I think is helping make better decisions from that standpoint and also challenging kind of a semi-conventional training approach, not because we're doing anything novel or totally different. We're just looking at it through a different lens and
Yeah.
diving into the physiological aspects of, is this a cardiorespiratory limitation, or sorry, cardiovascular limitation? Is it a respiratory limitation? Is it a muscular limitation? Like, is this person not strong enough to do this or doesn't have enough muscular endurance? Do they have a respiratory limitation from the standpoint of they're not moving enough air, they're hyperventilating, they're holding their breath, etc.? Or is this truly cardiovascular, which would be more general conditioning?
Yeah. So essentially you're trying to evaluate whether or not this athlete has the bandwidth from a physiological standpoint to express mechanical outputs, right? And so
That
now
was the
you're
most eloquent way of saying that. Yes.
so so now you can say like, well, what's lowest hanging fruit with this athlete, right? What is this athlete limit, like, is it a mechanical standpoint, or are we addressing the wrong thing here? And this is kind of really objectively saying like, all right, this is what we need to focus on.
And I would have thought in the past, and this goes back to challenging my biases, and one of the reasons I'm here, it's my bias would be to go heavy mechanical objective because that's the way that we make
Yeah.
decisions in the performance therapist world, especially in professional sports where there's time density, there's going back
Hmm.
to decisions, going back to you end up having to run a D plan when you're in a pro sporting environment because there's so many other cooks in the kitchen. There's so many other factors that need to influence a decision. And you also have to hang your hat on your decisions. So there has to be this standard alignment of, okay, we're going to do this battery of testing, and that's how we determine whether someone's prepared to perform in their sport. Well, yes, but that we believe leave something on the table, and that something is this is where I go to of I used to believe most all athletes generally like they didn't get worse from being too strong, team sport athletes, non-strength sport athletes, and I still believe that that's true. However, when you have a finite amount of time, and it goes back to the meeting expectations of athletes and organizations, well, what is the terminal task? And what is this athlete telling you around? Do they feel like they get heavy legs? Does their 3-point percentage drop halfway through the game? Well, that's when you start to get into uncovering this. And that's not about
Yeah,
training more. And that's not about getting
absolutely.
stronger. That's about recognizing someone's individual physiology and tapping into how do I train your physiology to be able to support you playing 38 minutes a game.
100%, right? It's like saying, we always say injuries are so multifactorial, right? And but we only address the mechanical side. Like, does this athlete move in an efficient manner? Are they, favoring one side or the other? But now we're saying like, look, hey, they check all the boxes from a movement standpoint, but from a physiological standpoint, like they can't they can't operate optimally to allow themselves to work and move efficiently. And so that's what we need to be addressing. And that's really fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm
very
I'm
intriguing.
basically studying physiology right now. And like I said, I'm still only 5 months into this, and I still feel like I'm just
Yeah,
scratching the surface. But I think that it is for me, again, going back to living
yeah.
true and aligning with my values, it's making me really question, what do I believe? Why do I believe it? And where do I go to find better answers to make better decisions?
We're kind of coming up on time, Alex, which is unfortunate because like we could still keep
Oh,
going, but this has been awesome. I mean, just I mean, I love hearing about your story and just all the insight into how you got to where you are today. I think it's so valuable because, again, biggest takeaway for me is like there's not one way to do this. When I opened up my facility in 2006, like there was really not many options, right?
right.
And but kudos to you for being brave enough to go down the path you have, and it
Mm.
sounds like you're really in a great place, and you're getting so much value about where you are, again, being around like good people and cultures and places you can learn. And look, keep doing those two things, and who knows where you're going to be in another 5 years.
Yeah, you're right about that. No, I really, really appreciate the conversation and opportunities. Again, it's to explore what I've done and where I want to go, and hopefully something was impactful.
Yeah,
But I really, really appreciate it. And obviously it's always
yeah.
good to catch up with you too.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody wants to follow your journey or like pick up on some of the things you're putting out in the world, where they can they follow you?
Yeah, so Instagram, my handle is AFHOOGZ. So AF
Love
Hoogs.
it.
It's a
All right.
silly play on my last name, but yeah, that's probably the best way to find me. You might find training videos, flights,
Great.
pair of Jordans.
Great. Love it.
You never know.
That you keep giving the people what they want, Alex.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I'll do my
Awesome.
best.
Awesome. Yeah, well,
All
really
right.
appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Please share the show if you've gotten any value from it, and subscribe, and because it helps us continue to bring on great guests like Alex. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks.